Today at the National Press Club, the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers. Fresh off his fifth budget, he's aiming to rebalance the tax system by curbing tax breaks for investors. A broken election promise he insists will help first home buyers. Jim Chalmers with today's National Press Club address.
Hello and welcome to the National Press Club, coming to you from the Great Hall of Parliament House in Canberra. My name's Tom Connell, I'm the club's president and also an anchor at Sky News Australia. We have our own budget number for this week. Today's Westpac address is our 52nd post-budget address by the Treasurer, and we thank the Treasurer for maintaining this long-standing tradition. It's always interesting, I think, to dive into the reaction from the media after a budget. There was one seemingly universal truth today. This budget does draw clear political battle lines. Beyond that, a bit more divide. It's been described as class warfare in the 21st century, a war with small business, a war on boomers, a war on aspiration, a cruel hoax, a mega tax hit, and there were a few cartoons that probably won't make it onto the photo wall in the Treasurer's office, I dare say. On the other side of the fence, the budget was described as a 7-course degustation. I think that's a compliment. It was also called rebalancing the scales, light where once it was dark for young Australians. One commentator said, "Much as it pains me to say anything nice about politicians, this is a good budget." And this final quote, "I feel vindicated." That, of course, was Bill Shorten. He was referring to the one other point of agreement across commentators, the changes to the CGT and negative gearing, most calling it a broken promise. There are two very different results from broken promises in recent times. The change to stage 3 of the income tax cuts, after which Labor won 94 seats, but then the carbon tax a little longer ago, which did seem to hound Labor all the way to the ballot box. I remind our members the club will have a podcast of this address on our website today. Now please join me to welcome the Treasurer, Dr. Jim Chalmers.
Well, a big thank you to you, Tom. We acknowledge together the Ngunnawal people, their elders, customs and continuous culture. And I wanted to thank you and the Press Gallery, the Press Club, Morris and its board and sponsors for the opportunity to flesh out some of the major themes of our fifth budget here in the Great Hall. I wanted to particularly thank Westpac for its ongoing sponsorship of the club and of this event, and I also wanted to mention the very well-deserved Lifetime Achievement Awards, which were presented to Laurie Oakes and to Michelle Grattan earlier in the week as well. Please put your hands together for Michelle, who's here. I also wanted to thank the Prime Minister, the Finance Minister, Katie Gallagher, and a whole range of other colleagues for making the time to be here today. I wanted to thank all of you for coming along once again. And I wanted to thank and acknowledge everyone who worked on and informed the decisions and the documents that we released last night, including all of the staff and officials right across the government. I also wanted to single out in particular Laura, who is here again today, and the kids, my mum and John back home, the essential elements of the Charmy Army. It's really hard being any Treasurer's family, not just the long absences, particularly at budget time, but all of the other ups and downs as well. And so I wanted to say how much I appreciate Laura and the family. I also wanted to acknowledge my other family of sorts, my office. My team is led so ably by Claudia Crawford and Glenn Granger, and back home in Logan City by Brenton Hill, who finishes up his long stint with us next month. I wanted to acknowledge them and thank every single member of my team who has been working in some instances 19 and 20 hours a day to put this budget together. Our team is full of the most dedicated, intelligent, well-motivated people, and they are making huge sacrifices for our country because we love it, we believe in it, and we want to make it better. And the same goes for the Treasury colleagues as well. From Jenny Wilkinson, who is here today, I thank you, Jenny, right through the department, her deputies Damien, Di, Ange, Kat, James and Ben, people like Pip and Jason, the entire tax team and everyone right throughout the department and right throughout the organisations. Working with them on this one and over the past 4 years has been such a cherished experience, and I want them all to know how much they are appreciated. So if you could please put your hands together for my colleagues. This was an especially difficult budget to put together. By far the hardest of the 5 so far, but also the most responsible and the most ambitious. In fact, the most ambitious of the 21, I think, that I've either worked on or responded to in and around this portfolio. And that's really what I wanted to get into with you today. How we balance today's global pressures with intergenerational obligations and also opportunities, and how we maintain direction amidst all of this disruption. Because the ambitious reforms at the core of this budget are not there despite all of this global uncertainty, but because of it. They're made more urgent by the combination of big cyclical and structural shifts underway in our economies and in our societies. Now, we have made some hard decisions, and we have come to a different view on some very contentious policies for the right reasons. And I'd rather defend a shift in policy than leave a broken status quo in place to do more damage, to marginalise more people over time. It would have been easier to see what's happening around the world as an excuse to leave some of the most difficult challenges in our economy for someone else to fix later. We made a different, more difficult choice in this budget to accelerate reform and not just absorb the shock. Now, there's a lot in what we released last night, too much to go through it all again, and I'll have the opportunity in coming weeks to get into all of the packages in more detail. What I wanted to do instead today is to talk about what the war in the Middle East meant for our deliberations over the summer and into the autumn. How we're seeing the conditions, global and domestic, how those forecasts changed between the last week of February and the first week of May. What we delivered, not just despite the challenging circumstances, but also because of them. How we calibrated, then recalibrated the major pieces of the budget for those conditions. Then, in a bit more detail, flesh out for you the intergenerational motivations which underpinned a lot of our decisions, especially when it comes to the intersection of housing and tax reform. And then put the breadth and depth of the budget's ambition into its proper context. But first, I think the best way to give you a sense of our deliberations is to explain how our thinking and planning evolved since December's mid-year update. Our budgets are typically sketched out in summer and then locked down in autumn. Of all of the budgets that I've worked on, they've usually been almost entirely consistent with the planning over the holidays, except for 2008 in the earliest days of the GFC. And when I think back to the notes that I was scribbling over December and January on planes and in the backyard with one eye on the kids in the pool, the formal and informal conversations with colleagues, all of the consultation I did in and around and after the Reform Roundtable, I'm really proud to say a very big part of all of that work featured in the policies that we announced last night. Now, nobody here would be surprised to learn that they weren't identical to what we would have done in February. It would be pretty strange if they were. But what might surprise you is how much we retained. Now, obviously, the emphasis on fuel security became a much bigger, more important part of the story. Of course it did. The way we thought about cost of living help changed when the fuel tax cut became necessary and we had to find almost $3 billion to fund it. Some good ideas were delayed for more work and for understandable reasons. But the core remained intact, and for good reasons as well. Now, we didn't finally decide on negative gearing and capital gains and trusts over the summer, though we did agree that to deliver intergenerational fairness and rebalance the system, there needed to be tax reform, even if we hadn't concluded what every element of that final package would look like. Now, every budget is calibrated for the conditions, and in this case, these conditions changed very substantially and quite late in the piece. The war began on the last day of summer, and we started recalibrating a bit on the first day of autumn. And what we've seen since has been serious, and it still risks becoming even more severe. Since that final day in February, oil prices are up more than 45%, the spot Brent price hit an all-time high, and we've seen around the same fall in supply from this shock alone as the past 4 oil shocks combined. The war fundamentally reshaped the budget forecasts. Treasury is now assuming the oil price will stay at around $100 a barrel until the end of June and then gradually come back to $80. This means inflation will be higher, household spending will be lower, and growth will be slower than we thought at the start of the year. Before the conflict, Treasury was actually going to upgrade household consumption next year by 1/4 percentage point to 2.5%. It ended up downgrading it by 0.5 percentage point instead, largely due to its higher outlook for inflation. Meanwhile, what was going to be GDP growth with a 2 in front of it is now GDP in the high ones, although with the private sector still the main driver. Now, Treasury expects unemployment to stay historically low, but it will be a bit higher for longer than they previously anticipated, hovering near 4.5% until the middle of 2028. Treasury also considered a much darker scenario, which you saw in the budget papers, where the oil price jumps to $200 a barrel and takes 3 years to fall back down. And even under that scenario, a scenario of that severity, we would still avoid a recession, but unemployment would reach pre-pandemic levels and inflation would peak above 7%. Now, we take some comfort from the direction of travel in our economy before the war began. If you think about it, by December last year, momentum was really clearly picking up in our economy. GDP growth in Australia in 2025 was quite strong. It was broad-based and it was led by the private sector. We finished the year with faster growth than any major advanced economy. Private demand grew faster and contributed about 3 times more to economic growth than public demand that year. Consumption was growing around 2.5% because real income growth had also recovered after a really challenging period. Real incomes were growing at more than twice the average of major advanced economies. Business investment grew strongly in the second half of last year, which helped to drive the CapEx forecasts for the financial year to almost $200 billion. For the first time in a decade, dwelling investment grew for 8 consecutive quarters. Our economy was performing strongly when we looked around the world. And we still had serious challenges in front of us. Inflation was much lower than its peak in 2022, but it was still too high. And although productivity growth had improved, it had been too weak for too long, so we needed to lift the speed limit of our economy. But the point I'm making is, towards the end of last year, we had a lot going for us as well before the war in the Middle East put some of that progress at risk. The oil shock that has come with that conflict is part of a bigger pattern of rolling, accelerating turbulence in the global economy, a half-century bookended by oil shocks where one big global disruption gives rise to the next. And we used to think of these economic shocks as punctuating long periods of calm, but now we have long periods of turbulence punctuated by short, sharp bursts of calm. In the last 2 decades alone, a subprime mortgage crisis, a pandemic, global inflation spikes triggered by war, trade tensions, now a huge energy shock that is pushing up prices, pushing down growth and punishing Australians, as I said in the speech last night. This is all happening against the backdrop of the energy transformation, the technological revolution, demographic and industrial change, and very big shifts in geopolitics. And these big shocks and these big shifts aren't rare anymore. As I said, they're almost routine, but their impacts are still profound. It's no longer possible to separate the cyclical from the structural change, or to deal with one and then deal with the other, or to wait for calm in the world to embark on big policy changes. If you wait for perfect stability to reform, you'll be waiting forever. This global turbulence is no excuse to roll up into a little ball and hope that it passes quickly. If anything, it's a reason to do more on resilience and more on reform more urgently. And that's the attitude that we adopted here in the budget. Now, the lead up to every budget involves hundreds of hours spent on thousands of individual decisions, because there are always pressures on essential spending. There are always more good ideas and worthy projects than funding available. Always colleagues defending each dollar in their portfolio or knocking down your door to secure an important new program or a local commitment. And the closer you get to the final document, the tougher all of these choices become. But I think the most important decision you make comes much earlier in the piece. It's about the character of the budget. Whether it aims high or muddles through. Whether it deals with the big changes going on around the world or hangs back and hides from them. Whether it takes responsibility for making things better and fairer for the next generation or leaves the heavy lifting to them. Now, long before we settled on the details of the reforms that we announced last night, we were resolved on the purpose and the urgency underpinning them. This approach led us to 5 main objectives: getting through the global oil shock and building resilience, taking the immediate pressure off people where we can at the cost of living and housing, making the economy more productive and competitive to lift living standards over time, reforming the tax system for workers, first home buyers, small businesses and future generations, and making the budget stronger, more sustainable and helping to take the pressure off inflation by saving more than we spend. So that left us with a fuel security package, more cost of living help, a productivity plan, a tax reform package and very substantial savings. Now, by now you're familiar with the constituent policy parts of all of this and with the essential elements of the story. So let me just sum up some of the biggest, most important parts of it in brief. Our new Working Australians tax offset, plus our other 3 income tax cuts, and the instant deduction will benefit the average worker by up to $2,816 in 2028. The productivity package will save businesses $10.2 billion in compliance costs every single year, and our competition policy reforms alone could boost GDP by $13 billion. Last night's budget was $44.9 billion better off compared to our mid-year update just in December, and more than $250 billion better than what we inherited when we came to office. Gross debt is $173 billion lower next year, and lower in every single year compared to when we came to office. It will peak 9 percentage points of GDP lower as well. It will peak earlier and lower. That means we'll avoid more than $70 billion in interest payments on the debt. Average real spending growth is at its lowest level in almost 3.5 decades over the 8 years to 2030. We found an unprecedented $63.8 billion in savings. For the first time on record, we've returned every single dollar of revenue upgrades to the bottom line in back-to-back budget updates. Treasury is projecting that the budget will return to balance in the medium term, driven mostly by our structural savings. And one of the parts of the fiscal story we're most proud of is that net save figure. We've been able to deliver an ambitious reforming budget at the same time as a $26.1 billion net save. And even when you strip out our responsible provisions from previous updates, it's still an $8.2 billion save. This is the second update in a row where the net policy line in the reconciliation table has been positive, and that's only happened 6 times in the past 3 decades. Now, of all the fine balances that we struck last night, perhaps the most essential was between responding to the demands of the here and now while taking seriously our intergenerational obligations. That matters right across the board, but it's absolutely essential to understanding the intersection between the tax reform and the housing packages in the budget. I encourage you to consider this. In the decade to 1999, average house prices and full-time incomes grew at around the same rate. In the decades since then, that link has been broken. House prices have risen by more than 400% since 1999, more than twice as fast as average full-time earnings. Now, since the Howard government introduced the 50% capital gains tax discount at the turn of the century, there's been a big decoupling between housing and incomes. Supply hasn't kept pace with rising demand, but tax settings have also played a role here. Now, this collapse in housing affordability in Australia has disproportionately affected younger Australians. Over those 2 decades, home ownership for people between 25 and 34 has plummeted 7 percentage points. And our long-standing productivity challenge means the generation born in the 1990s is the first in decades not earning significantly higher incomes than those that came before them. And this is even more striking when you consider we're likely to have just 2.5 working-age Australians for every older one by the 2060s. Now, any objective observer would hear these facts and conclude that the status quo, where our housing and tax systems meet, is unfair and it's unacceptable. As a society, we're expecting too much of these younger working people. It's not just that they're struggling to get into the housing market or that they are the victims of poor productivity growth for far too long, but they'll also inevitably wear a bigger burden over time as our population gets older and demand for government services rises. Now, these are the challenges that our two packages on tax and on housing directly address. They're about making the system fairer for workers, first home buyers and future generations. And that was a major part of the motivation behind our $47 billion housing plan. It's also a big part of the motivation for our first 3 rounds of tax cuts, our changes to make superannuation fairer and more sustainable, and our reforms to make sure companies are paying their fair share of tax. This is just some of the substantial progress that we've already made on housing and tax. But the reforms in this budget go a lot further by starting to rebalance a tax system that favours assets over workers. Concessions like negative gearing and the capital gains tax discount provide generous treatment for income from assets that isn't available for labour income. These policies do little to support new housing supply. In fact, in the past 5 years, more than 80% of investor borrowing has been for existing housing. And the types of property investments that we really need more of, like units and apartments, have actually been worse off on average under the current 50% discount than they would have been under indexation. So it's clear that these concessions have fundamentally distorted our housing market. The current tax arrangements tip the balance against first home buyers, and that's why we're changing them. For example, Treasury's analysis shows about 1 in every 3 negatively geared investor receives a net income tax subsidy overall, even if the property turns a profit. In other words, Australian taxpayers are effectively paying a third of those negatively geared investors to own an investment property. So we're coming at this housing challenge from every responsible angle, maintaining that primary emphasis on supply, but recognising that while the challenge starts there, it doesn't end there. All of this data makes it very clear, I think, in a very compelling case that we need to make some changes, even difficult changes, to help level the playing field. Now, the reforms to negative gearing and capital gains in this budget will help first home buyers and build on all of our work to boost supply, reduce red tape and make it easier for younger people to get a deposit. Housing supply is still the main game, and that's why this budget has a big focus on more supply. Not just in how we've designed these tax measures, but also the $2 billion for enabling infrastructure, where the states and territories commit to further housing reforms like faster approvals and releasing more land. Another way we're taking steps to rebalance the system is by making sure that the tax rates paid on income from assets held in discretionary trusts, as well as future capital gains, are more in line with those paid by the average worker. We're redirecting the revenue from all of these reforms over the next 4 years to provide more tax cuts for working Australians, as well as more support to businesses to drive productivity and investment and innovation. The new Working Australians tax offset and the $1,000 instant tax deduction are actually unique in our tax system because they provide the first broad-based tax relief specifically targeted at working people. By introducing these changes, we're setting up a new architecture that until now has been absent from the Australian system. And this will allow future tax relief and reform to build on these tax cuts and continue the work of rebalancing the tax burden so that it's shared more fairly between assets and labour. This is a down payment to make it easier to provide more support for workers and future generations. This is about tax relief and it's about tax reform to make our economy work in the interests of more Australians, more businesses and future generations. These changes and this intergenerational focus aren't about putting older and younger people at 10 paces. We recognise and respect the massive contribution that older Australians have made and continue to make to our country and our economy. Many Australians are finding it incredibly difficult to get into the housing market, but that's not the fault of older Australians. It's the fault of governments that haven't taken this housing challenge seriously enough. Now, these changes are about recognising some of these legitimate intergenerational concerns, which are also often shared by older people as well. We don't judge people who've done well. We want more people to do well. So this budget is really the balance point between a post-election year of delivery and the coming year of more ambitious reform. And we're not pretending or claiming that one night or one set of numbers means that we've solved every problem in our economy. Of course not. No government will ever do that. But it was a big and serious effort. Easily the most responsible and the most ambitious budget of the 5 that we've put together, with the most savings, the most tax reform, meaningful ways to shift the dial on productivity and consequential policy changes right across the portfolios, and easily the one with the highest degree of difficulty as well. Calibrated and considered as the global economy absorbed one of the biggest, or the biggest, oil shock in history. We know that our decisions will be contested, and that's okay. The reform road has speed bumps and it has twists and turns. We're doing what's necessary, not what's convenient, at a time of extraordinary, accelerating change in the world playing out in our economy and in our society. And when you look around the world, from Farage to Farah, the choice this moment presents for parties of government is really clear. We are the last ones standing in the sensible centre of Australian politics, but we aren't standing still. Standing still would make us the reluctant defenders of a status quo that doesn't work. We stand for real change that makes a real difference. Reforms that empower our people to be the beneficiaries of change and not its victims. That's why everything that the world has thrown at us over the past few months has changed the focus of our response, but not the level of our ambition. And not because reform is easy, but because we owe it to the faith Australians have placed in us to make a difference and not just to mark time. And with that, I thank you and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Treasurer. Last week, Michelle Bullock said it doesn't take much additional spending to make the job of returning inflation to target more challenging. From the budget papers, so the net amount of extra money in the economy, including government decisions, payments, etc., is $18 billion next financial year. Does $18 billion in 1 year qualify as much additional spending?
Well, a couple of things about that. I mean, first of all, if you look at that $18 billion figure, Tom, that is mostly variations. So things like the indexation of the pension is part of that number. If you look at the net impact of our decisions, it gets closer to $3 billion. There's some fairly substantial defence spending in that number as well. And so the composition of those numbers matters as well. And overall, if you look at the budget papers and the advice that we received from Treasury colleagues, I think from memory, page 86 of the main document, what it says is the budget is taking the pressure off inflation. And it's doing that because we took the task of responsible economic management very seriously. You know, the underlying cash balance in each year of the forwards is better than what it was in December. Same when it comes to the debt trajectory. Spending as a share of the economy gets from up around 20% of GDP to closer to 26% of GDP. $64 billion in gross savings, $26.1 billion net save. If you look at some of the commentary from the private sector economists, they make it clear as well that the budget that we handed down is not adding to inflationary pressures in our economy. And so obviously I'm not going to give free advice to the Independent Reserve Bank. They will make their own decisions in the usual way. But everybody should rest assured that the budget we handed down last night, pay tribute to Katie and other colleagues for this, is historically responsible. If you compare our net impact we've made on the budget, compare the magnitude of the savings that are in the budget, that is a historically responsible document, and that's because we take the inflation challenges in our economy very seriously.
I do have a few questions. I'll just make note of my colleagues. I'm only going to ask one of them. So perhaps that could be an example. We'll begin on the floor from recent Lifetime Achievement Award winner, Michelle Grattan from The Conversation.
Thank you. Treasurer, the government has a target of 1.2 million new homes by 2029, and at the moment you're falling behind that aspiration. Is the government still firmly committed to that target, and how much closer, in precise numbers, will your various housing measures collectively bring you to meeting that target?
It's an ambitious target, and I'm confident that we can get there if everybody does their bit. And the Commonwealth, I think, has proven we are not just willing but enthusiastic about building more homes. If you look at the housing package in its totality in the budget last night, the combined impact of all of the housing policies that were released last night would see another 30,000 homes built in our communities and in our economy. That's the net impact of the budget on the housing numbers. If you look right across the $47 billion of investment, there's a huge emphasis on supply. Overwhelmingly, the government's focus is on housing supply. I pay tribute to Claire O'Neill and before her Julie Collins for the work that gets done in the housing portfolio. And so the budget is making a net contribution to housing to get us closer to that ambitious target. It will be difficult, but I think that we can get there. Now, if you think about recent developments in the housing market, acknowledging that there is much more to do, not just on supply, but some of these other issues about the difficulty that a lot of Australians feel in getting a toehold in the market. But if you think about some of the raw numbers, when it comes to dwelling investments, dwelling commencements, we saw commencements go up by 26% last year. That's progress, especially when you consider they were falling 28% when we came to office. So commencements starting to come good last year. Approvals through to March of this year were up 13.1%. They were falling 21.6% when we came to office. So turning approvals around, turning commencements around. Similar story for investment and in some of the other categories as well. And so the point that I'm making is we made some progress. We know that there's heaps more to do to try and hit that ambitious target, but the budget shows that we're willing to do our bit.
David Spears from the ABC.
Treasurer, thank you for the speech and appreciate the spotlight that's on this microphone.
We're waiting for you to sing a song, David, I think.
Don't tempt me. You began the speech by talking about the difficulty of this budget. Can I take you to something that was arguably more difficult? That was taking some of these tax changes to an election. In 2019, you were the Shadow Finance Minister and you talked about some of these tax incentives going to the top end of town, and you were going after that top end of town. You're not using that language now. You're talking more benignly about rebalancing the incentives from income earned from assets to income earned from labour. But I wonder, should those who have built up an asset regard this as the limit of your ambition to go after them, whether you call them the top end of town or not, or should they expect this as the start of more to come?
Well, my ambition when it comes to future tax reform is to try and provide more tax relief for working people. That's why I've set up this architecture. That's why we've been very upfront in the budget papers and in interviews since the budget was released in saying that this government's very enthusiastic about returning more bracket creep when it's affordable and responsible to do that. You know, this is a government which has already cut income taxes 5 different ways, and we've only been here 4 years, and so people should take their cues from that. The reform ambition I have into the future is to try and provide more tax relief, to return more of this bracket creep, which you can see in the budget papers. And so we've been upfront about that. The architecture that we set up in recognising that we need to better align the tax paid by workers with the tax paid by people who make their living in other legitimate ways, is we set up this architecture to make that easier on the income tax side for workers. And so I intend to make the most of that at some future point. I suspect that successive governments after us would do that too.
Katina Curtis from the West Australian.
Thanks, Treasurer. There's about 110,000 first home buyers every year. The changes in the budget, you say, will help about another 75,000 people, but that's over a decade. So it seems like hardly a very big annual increase. Is it worth it, or does that show that this is just an ideological change?
Well, it's worth it for 75,000 Australians who wouldn't otherwise get a look in the housing market if we hadn't taken the difficult decision that we announced last night. I've heard this argument put through the course of some other interviews today, Katina, and I understand where it's coming from. It's essentially an argument to go further. But we think we've struck the right balance here. We think getting another 75,000 Australians, and most likely primarily younger Australians, into the housing market is a very good thing to do. It's worth the political risk that we've taken in coming to a different view and changing our policy position in some contentious areas. And for those 75,000 Australians and for other Australians as well, the status quo is busted in the housing market and in the tax system. And where those two things intersect creates a level of intergenerational inequity that we're not prepared to tolerate. And it would have been the easiest thing in the world to see that problem, to recognise that the longer we leave it, the worse it gets, and to leave it unattended. And so that's why we took the difficult decision that we took and announced last night. And I'd rather, I think I said this to one of your counterparts last night, I'd rather do the right thing by those 75,000 people and explain why a change in policy was necessary and own that, than to leave this problem for someone else to fix down the track, and in the meantime to let this problem get worse. Too many Australians, particularly young Australians, are locked out of the housing market. It requires government policy to help rectify that, rebalance that, and that's what motivates us.
Next question, Andrew Clennell from Sky News.
Afternoon, Treasurer.
Hi, Andrew.
This budget has a big new tax take of more than $100 billion over 10 years from your new taxes, and according to Treasury's modelling, the policies increase rents and only lower the growth in cost of a median home by 19 grand. On top of this, myself and the older people in the room here can negatively gear now on existing property, but young people can't anymore. So when it comes to young people in this country, are you really on their side? Or, as young people would say, is it all about getting that bread for the taxman?
Are you sure young people say that, Andrew?
He did actually ask the office and we didn't come up with much. Maybe we're all too old.
I texted my son to double check it just before I came up here.
Tom reckons you asked around the office.
That's true, and they all say it.
I think there are three important parts to your question. Let me try and touch on each of them. First of all, the impact of our policy. We've provided the Treasury modelling, negligible impact on rents. House prices will continue to grow, but more slowly, about 2% more slowly. That's the $19,000 figure that you're rightly referring to. Right across the budget, though, our housing policies will add to supply, and that will put downward pressure on rents. So on impacts, that's the first part of your question. In terms of this issue of are we providing a level of concessionality to older people that is no longer available to younger people, obviously one of the most important counters to that is that if you're a younger person with the means to invest in housing, go for it, just invest in a new home, add to housing supply. We are not ending negative gearing entirely. We're saying if you want to negatively gear in the future, buy a new home, genuinely add to housing supply in this country, and then that will tick a couple of boxes at once. And so young people can avail themselves of that. Now, the third part was your question about the longer term, the tax arrangements into the medium term of the budget. So first of all, everybody needs to understand that over the forward estimates, what we are collecting from negative gearing, capital gains and trust changes is being returned to workers and to businesses in the tax package. The tax package over the forward estimates is broadly neutral. But you're right to say that over the longer period, some of these tax changes will raise a bit more. Now, the thing that I wanted to point out here, the really important point, which is missing in some of the coverage today, is if you look at the chart on page 91 of the budget papers, budget paper 1 last night, we've provided a chart which shows that the very substantial medium-term improvement in the budget is driven by some multiples by our savings decisions, by the good work that Mark and Jenny and others did on the NDIS and some of our other savings. By the end of that 10-year period, 3 times more of the improvement comes from savings rather than tax changes. And that's because the heavy lifting in this budget, the most responsible part of this budget, is being done by savings rather than by tax changes. So to young people...
It's still a lot of tax bread, though.
To the young people who have the concern that you have raised, we are trying to rebalance the tax system on their behalf. We're providing tax relief 5 different ways to younger people. It's a government which is very enthusiastic about cutting income taxes where we can.
Next question, Phil Curry from the AFR.
Thanks, Tom. Treasurer, when you remodelled the stage 3 tax cuts in the last term of government, when you undid the legislation you inherited, you reintroduced the 37% tax bracket and you dropped the income threshold at which the top tax bracket would apply from $200,000 to $190,000. In your speech today and on radio this morning, you've made it quite clear that you envisage future tax relief being delivered via the WATO, so it just focuses on salary earners, not people who earn their taxes from other sources like assets. Are you saying that, as far as you're concerned going forward, that income tax reform in terms of lowering tax brackets is over and the easiest ways to do is just increase the WATO?
No, I'm saying it gives us another option. It gives us another piece of architecture if we want to target very specifically future tax relief for working people. We've got the architecture to do that now. This is a new development in our tax system. It's a genuine reform. What it does is effectively lifts the tax-free threshold for people who work for a living. And so it's another option that governments will have, our government and other governments which follow us. They can choose between providing tax relief the usual way, the way that we have 3 times, or via the Working Australians tax offset. And so in creating that architecture, I'm not for 1 second ruling out providing tax relief, income tax relief in the way that we already have 3 times. I think any government would weigh up its options in the future and provide as much income tax relief as it can afford to return some of that bracket creep and provide cost of living relief essentially, primarily for people who work for a living.
Thank you.
Next question, Anna Henderson from SBS.
Thank you, and thank you for your address. Treasurer, why is it that the Treasury has repeatedly underestimated net overseas migration? And given we are seeing those higher figures, can we be confident that the years ahead, the reduction that is forecast is going to be a reality?
Well, first of all, it's not the case that Treasury has always underestimated. In fact, I think in the last full year, net overseas migration came in 30,000 people fewer than the Treasury forecast. I'll check that in case I haven't got that quite right, but that's off the top of my head, I think it came in lower last full year than what the Treasury was anticipating. And so there's the usual amount of uncertainty about forecasting a range of numbers in the budget, including that one. What we're seeing this year and next year is more a reflection of fewer people departing Australia rather than another spike in arrivals like we saw, which began before we came to office. And so there is a little bit of volatility in those numbers, but we see volatility in other forecasts as well. It's gone in both directions from memory in the Treasury forecast, and there's a couple of measures in the budget which are about putting downward pressure on that net overseas migration number a bit further. The most important thing for people to remember, including people, not you, Anna, of course, but people who seek to politicise the migration system for the most divisive reasons, is net overseas migration has actually come down 45% from its peak. When we came to office, net overseas migration was surging. We got that down by 45%, back closer to more normal levels. We still expect it to normalise over the course of the next couple of years, but fewer departures are complicating that story.
Thank you.
Matthew Cranston from The Australian.
Treasurer, just to follow on from Phil's question, You've said the architecture of the Watto is an option for returning bracket creep, and you said also the use of the way you've given tax cuts in the past as a way to return bracket creep. Can you rule out indexing any or all of the thresholds as a way to reduce bracket creep? And when I mean indexation, it's a permanent fixture. And you're a big fan of looking at the trust reform. That's been your thing. Is there much of a difference between a non-refundable credit and a franking credit?
Well, on your first question, when it comes to returning bracket creep, as I said to Phil, and I think in the speech and in on other occasions, we're enthusiastic about returning bracket creep. We've now done it both ways. We've done it by cutting rates and thresholds, and we've done it by providing this other architecture. We haven't been exploring the option of indexation. There are good reasons, I think, for governments to decide the appropriate level of tax relief to return as much bracket creep as they can when they can afford to do that. If you look at one of the consistent themes throughout the life of this government, it's cutting income taxes for working people. We've only been here 4 years and we've done it 5 times in, well, really 3 different ways. The usual way, the instant deduction, and now the working Australian tax offset. And so all of those options are available to our government and to future governments. If another government wants to take a decision to index the thresholds, then that's a choice available to them. But I think there are good reasons to tailor tax relief to the conditions and to make sure that they are as responsible as they can be. We can only ever provide as much tax relief as we can afford to do, and for those people who say that the working Australian tax offset is relatively modest, we understand that, but it's part of 5 different ways that we're cutting taxes, and it will give us the architecture to dial up that tax relief in the future if we want to. On your other question, we're not proposing in this package to change the treatment of franking credits and including the way that we think about some of the associated issues of refundability and the like.
Thanks, Treasurer.
Paul Sakal from the SMH and the Age.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Treasurer. Treasurer, you've talked about this budget being the most responsible in a long time. Your fiscal strategy relies in large part on enormous savings in the NDIS, as well as the really large revenue upgrades on the housing tax concessions over time. Those NDIS changes haven't passed the Parliament. The states may oppose some of it. Even Mark Butler says the changes to eligibility may be really difficult to work out. Do you accept that there's a huge level of risk if that underpins your fiscal strategy and return to balance in the budget?
Well, there are a number of elements of the budget which are difficult but doable. Again, I pay tribute to those colleagues for in the NDIS portfolios, Mark and Jenny, but Katie's done a heap of work. The ERC's worked very closely with them. Probably the issue that came back and forth to the ERC the most over the course of the last 12 months or so. And that's a really important reform in the budget. It's not just a saving, it kind of diminishes it to describe it in that form. It's really a very, very key reform in social and economic policy, and it will pay dividends. Now, I understand that there is a level of trepidation amongst the commentators because what we've seen in the NDIS in the past has exceeded the original expectations that we had for it. So I understand that. And we're very cautious about changes that we make to the NDIS. But our motivation there is really clear. And we're trying to save the thing from itself. It was growing too fast. It would have consumed itself. Some future government with different motivations to ours would have been tempted to, end or effectively ruin the scheme. And so as big supporters of the NDIS, we took very seriously our responsibility to it. And I understand that there are big numbers associated with it because the costs were blowing out so substantially. I understand that it will take a lot of work, and not just at the Commonwealth level, to make sure that the numbers that we've accounted for in the budget come to fruition, but I'm confident that we can.
Patrick Commons from The Guardian.
Thanks, Treasurer. I think going back a little bit to Katina's question earlier, and you spoke about a broken status quo, and we know that housing is very much at the heart of that. Would grandfathering the changes to CGT and negative gearing, totally grandfathering them, would that have delivered a bigger improvement in housing affordability now? And if so, why did your government not pursue that option?
Well, I think like every difficult policy area, you're looking to strike a series of fine and correct balances, and we think we have in the tax package. We respect and recognise decisions that people have taken in the past, and so it is essentially a prospective set of tax reforms that we are proposing. So respecting and recognising investments is one of the principles that we tried to stick to. Now, of course, there will be some people who argue that we should do more, that we shouldn't provide transitional arrangements. There were some, obviously, who wanted to defend every element of the existing arrangements, but we think we've found the right way through here. We've balanced respecting and recognising those former investments at the same time as we're changing the system for the future, so that we continue to provide a discount in the CGT system, but calculated in a way that minimises some of these other distortions. What I tried to say in the speech and what I've tried to say over the course of the last couple of days is the change that was made in 1999 introduced, I think, a very serious distortion in the tax system flowing through to how people think about investment in this country. And if you look at, there's a 2-decade period in there, in the last quarter of a century, there's 2 decades that we looked at, where on average what we saw was the CGT arrangements were overcompensating people piling into the existing housing market and undercompensating people investing in shares or units or in other investment categories. And so we're trying to fix that distortion, but we're trying to do it in a way that smooths out and minimises the market disruptions and recognises that a whole bunch of people made a whole series of decisions based on the old arrangements.
You spoke about the generations in your speech and not being a war between them and wanting younger people to be able to sort of catch up on opportunities. What about people, perhaps Gen X, millennials, who are going to try to go down the same path their parents did? Are you unapologetic that it's going to be harder for Australians to get ahead financially from now on?
Well, I wouldn't agree that that's the conclusion. I mean, first of all, we are the party of aspiration, and if younger people have got the means and the inclination to invest in housing, they can continue to negatively gear a new property. That option is still available to them. But, I think this question of aspiration is really a very important one. One of the big differences between the political parties is the different way that we view aspiration. Our opponents have got this kind of narrow, backward-looking view about aspiration. They see aspiration as the exclusive preserve of people who are already doing well. They're about fewer people doing well, and we're about more people doing well, and that's the difference. And that applies to different levels of income, that applies to different generations as well. Aspiration is something that every Australian should feel entitled to, and for too long in this country, I think younger people in particular have felt disconnected, disregarded, disrespected, particularly in the housing market. The way that our housing market and our tax system intersects has created this sense that aspiration is something that we admire in the past, but not aspiration that people can feel entitled to in the future. And so that is underpinning all of this. That's really one of the big things that's driving us. There's nothing aspirational about stacking the deck against younger Australians. There's nothing aspirational about knowing that the housing market and the tax system are intersecting to shut a whole generation of Australians out of the dream of home ownership and leaving that undisturbed or unattended to. So this is an aspirational package, an aspirational government, an aspirational country. But we can't have a situation endure where we say to a smaller and smaller group of people, you're entitled to aspiration, but this bigger and bigger group over here is not.
Mark Riley from the 7 Network.
Thanks, Tom. Treasurer, I just want to take a broader look at your decision to change negative gearing in CGT and the implications that has on your government and the complexion of your government. The reasons you've given today is that the young generations are locked out of the housing market. That was apparent abundantly before the last election, so abundantly, in the Prime Minister's words, we asked him and you and others at least 50 times whether you were going to change these tax arrangements, and you said no. A lot of people were compelled to vote for the Albanese government in 2022 and again in 2025 because of that promise of openness and accountability and integrity. You will be a different government. These are people who heard never ever a GST. They heard there will be no carbon tax. They heard no cuts to the ABC, no cuts to the SBS. And then they heard an opposition say, we're going to be different. Won't those voters wake up this morning and say, you're not different. You've just proved you're just another lying government.
Look, to be frank with you, Mark, we expect that charge will be levelled at us. It's not unexpected. And to the extent that we have changed our position on these policy areas, it's not especially unfair for people to point out that the position that we put last night in the budget is different to the position that we held and expressed 12 months ago. The comments that we made in the last election reflected our position at the time, which was that we thought we could do enough in the housing market to focus overwhelmingly on supply and with the 5% deposits. And it's become increasingly clear to us that in addition to doing all of that work, that we needed to take on this status quo, which is locking people out of the housing market, and make some difficult changes. We know that that brings with it political controversy. We expect the view that you just put in your question, Mark, to be put to us. We obviously knew when we took this difficult decision that people who didn't want to engage on the substance of this issue will engage on the politics of this issue. So we knew that. I think the worst thing would be to do, the easier thing to do, would be to leave things as they are and understand that the longer we leave things, the worse they get. And so my view, and I know that some people will have a different view, but it would have been easier but wrong to leave these arrangements in place for longer and leave it to someone else to fix them. And it is my view, increasingly my view, and I think I'd be very surprised if people here didn't share this view, that there is a growing sense, an accelerating sense, in our society and societies like ours around the world, that there is a huge risk of people feeling disconnected and disregarded when it comes to our economy. And in my view, the prospect of more people losing hope or more people losing connection is a problem which transcends all of the others, including the political considerations you've put to me.
Next question, Jason Koutsoukas from the Saturday paper.
Treasurer, thanks for your speech. 40 years ago tomorrow, Paul Keating issued his famous warning about the Banana Republic, prompting that government to cut Commonwealth spending to around 23.5% of GDP. What's changed since then to looking forward to keep Commonwealth spending above 26% of GDP?
Well, I mean, you all know that I've spent a lot of time thinking about that period and that Treasurer and that Prime Minister, and had a lot of discussions with Paul in the course of putting this package together last night. I think Paul would recognise, and all of you would recognise, it's not 1986 anymore. And our economy's changed, largely for the better and largely thanks to some of the gutsy things that Paul did. Our economy is different. 40 years have passed, our society is different. The demographic makeup of our country is different. And so some of the pressures on our budget that Katie and I spend a lot of time grappling with, you know, the pressures around ageing, the pressures around caring for people with a disability, the big defence investments that Richard leads with Pat, all of these things are putting additional pressure on the budget. One of the things that I'm proud of and confident about in the budget last night is that we have taken these challenges of big, long-term spending pressures more seriously than our predecessors did. And even if you think about that measure of spending as a share of the economy, even though it's changed over time as some of those pressures have intensified, we've still got a situation where spending as a share of the economy under our predecessors was up around a third of the economy, and we know there are reasons for that. But it was up around a third of the economy. We got it down under a quarter. It's settled in the 26s. But at the start of the forward estimates, spending as a share of the economy is about up near 27%, just south of. By the end of the forward estimates, it's closer to 26%. And in the context of all of the pressures that the budget is under, we think that's a big and serious effort.
Charles Croucher from the Nine Network.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Treasurer. You've made it clear you think getting into the housing market is too difficult, particularly for young people. That's not new. You knew that in 2016 and 2019 when that was Labor policy. Given you've now changed your decision on that, I want to get into the mechanics. When did you rediscover that housing is difficult? Was it when you won 94 seats at the election? Was it when you were looking at the kids in the backyard with one eye on them? Was it an informal or formal conversation? In the 15 months since it wasn't difficult enough to take it to the public, what's changed?
Well, I think some of these challenges have intensified. And as I said in responding to some of those earlier questions, the position that we took to the election reflected our almost singular focus on supply. Our focus in the housing package last night is still supply, but it's expanded to include some new measures on youth homelessness, for example.
Was there a moment that brought that on?
Yep, coming to it, Charles. And so those pressures have intensified. And as I said before, I think in response to Mark's question and other questions, the choice that we had was whether to let that continue and get worse or to do something about it and take the political risk to change our position. Now, on the timing of all that, these decisions were taken by the Expenditure Review Committee of the Cabinet relatively late in the process, either towards the end of April or perhaps the beginning of May, but in the last few weeks we changed our position. Over the summer, I was thinking about tax reforms. I was thinking about business tax reforms. I was engaging with probably a number of people in this room about business tax in and around the reform roundtable that we hosted in the second half of last year. We were thinking about tax reforms. We knew that there were a series of challenges in our economy, inflation, productivity, some of these other challenges. So we were thinking about tax reform over the summer. There wasn't a moment where we flicked the switch into considering some of these sorts of issues, but the decision was taken relatively recently to change our policy.
Jessica Wang from News Corp.
Thank you, Treasurer. Jessica Wang from the Daily Telegraph. Given that buying into shares has become a method of investing for younger Australians who are struggling to get into the housing market, in some cases they use micro investment platforms or buy directly off the ASX, what is your response to a young Australian who has observed that Labor has made it significantly harder to build their wealth and in some cases save for a housing deposit while older Australians remain unaffected?
Well, what we're doing is removing the distortion in the capital gains tax system. And as I said before in a response to an earlier question, if you look at a couple of decades of averages, what we've seen is that shares have been undercompensated for in the old system. What we're trying to fix here is this big distortion introduced in 1999. And what that distortion meant was more and more people getting into buying established homes rather than getting into the share market. You can actually see since that 1999 change, a change in the way in Australians' appetite to invest in the share market. And so it's entirely possible, depending on that person's circumstances, their marginal rate, how long they invest for, what kind of shares they're invested in. You can't create a blanket arrangement for every different circumstance, but it's entirely possible that by removing the distortion that we make shares more attractive rather than less.
Thank you. James Mager from Bloomberg.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks, Treasurer. Switching from housing, looking at the assumptions on iron ore prices, coal prices, LNG prices, that kind of thing in the budget, they're very low compared to where markets are now. And looking at what's happening in the Straits of Hormuz, they're probably very low where those kind of prices are going to be in 3 months' time. Does that difference between where you're forecasting them to be and where they're likely to be provide a lot more room for either a better bottom line of the budget than you're actually forecasting yesterday, or tax cuts going down the road? And you had this doomsday scenario in the budget where oil goes to $200, but it doesn't actually have any kind of costing on the benefits to Australia from, though, again, those higher taxes. So do you, those higher market prices. Yeah. Do you see, the overall benefits of that being positive or negative for the economy? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, we're deliberately conservative in the way that we forecast. When I say we, when Treasury forecasts the commodity price outlook, that's been a feature of governments of both political persuasions to try and be conservative about that. It can go the other way. And so we try and be as responsible as we can, and sometimes that means being as conservative, maintaining that sense of conservatism when it comes to those sorts of forecasts. We take a price in those markets, bulk commodity markets, and it typically trails away to a agreed endpoint over a period of time, over a number of quarters. And so we haven't made big changes to that. We made a minor change in iron ore not that long ago. We made a minor change, I think, in gold not that long ago, but overwhelmingly we've tried to maintain the same kind of arrangements that successive governments have used to be conservative about that. In terms of the impact of what we're seeing in the Middle East on commodity prices flowing through to the budget, I think the revenue upgrade ex-GST was, I think, $34.5 billion in the budget. About $9.5 billion of that was from the conflict. And so relatively modest numbers in terms of the impact of what we're seeing in the Middle East. That doesn't take into consideration, of course, some of the downside as well. It's a net figure, but it doesn't take into account all of the downside. So a long way of saying deliberately conservative. The revenue upgrade from what we're seeing in the Middle East is not anywhere near what some people were anticipating. And also don't forget that there's a year in the budget where we've actually had to downgrade our revenue, and that's because of the impact of the conflict, the lingering impact of the conflict on growth and jobs.
Coming up to time, you'll make Joseph stay if you can squeeze him in. What do you think?
Beg your pardon?
You'll make Joseph stay if we can squeeze him in?
Yeah, let's go.
Mr. Treasurer.
Yeah, sure.
I think we've covered housing a fair bit, so we might just shift to something else. So AUKUS, the budget confirmed that that the Australian Submarine Agency budget it blew out by 33%. I think it's grown to about $512 million. So over the next 4 years, the cost of the nuclear submarine program has grown by an additional $431 million. I'm just wondering, with the total 10-year undersea warfare bill, basically, I think it was put at $130 billion over the next decade. Can Australia really afford to continue this without cannibalising other areas of the ADF, especially at a time where we're seeing conflicts pop up left, right and centre?
Well, the world's a dangerous place, and I think big investments in national security make a lot of sense. And there will always be the risk in some of these big defence projects that the cost blows out. I really want to thank in Richard's absence and Pat's absence, so much effort in our government goes into making sure we get value for money from these big sums. But overwhelmingly, in principle, when I go to these discussions about investments in our national security, first of all, I recognise that national security and economic security are effectively the same thing now. And nothing comes cheap in defence if you're serious about making Australians safer. And I know that there's a range of views about that. But from my point of view, big investments in national security make a lot of sense. You can see big investments in the budget we handed down last night. And in making those big investments, the responsibility on all of us is to make sure that we get maximum value for money when we make them.
We're at time, but a yes-no question's always easy. Road user charge, you said its time has come in August. It wasn't in the budget. So yes-no, is it still on the to-do list?
Yes.
Okay. I know your favourite part of Budget Week is talking to journos, so you've got another Press Club membership to come down and have a yarn with us later on. We do thank you for continuing the tradition, though, Treasurer. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank you.
Thanks very much, everyone. Thank you.